The knock came at 7 in the morning. 3 sharp raps, then silence, then 3 more. I was standing in my kitchen in a bathrobe, holding a mug of coffee I just poured, and something about the sound made my stomach drop before I even reached the door. I don't know how to explain that. Call it memory living in your body. Because when I opened that door and saw my parents standing on my porch, my mother gripping her purse with both hands, my father looking at the porch boards instead of my face, my first thought wasn't surprise. My first thought was, so it finally happened. Whatever they needed badly enough to find me, it had finally arrived. And my second thought, the one that came right behind it like a wave, was that the last time I saw these two people, I was 18 years old, standing in a driveway with a single duffel bag, and my father told me I had until sundown to be gone. Let me take you back. Because none of what happened on that porch makes sense without the 10 years that came before it. And I promise you, by the time we get there, you are going to understand every single decision I made. I grew up in Cloverdale, Ohio, in a yellow house on a corner lot with a tire swing in the backyard that nobody used after I turned 10. My parents, Dennis and Carol Vance, were not cruel people in the way that word usually gets used. They didn't yell constantly. Nobody hit anybody. We had dinner together most nights and went to church on Sundays, and took a road trip every summer to somewhere moderately interesting. From the outside, we were fine. Fine is the most dangerous word in the English language, because it covers so much that isn't. I have one sibling. My brother Marcus. 2 years younger, golden-haired, naturally charming in the way that some people just are. Like they were born already knowing how to enter a room. Marcus was the kind of kid that adults loved immediately. He played baseball, got invited to every party, never had to try very hard at anything because the world kept leaning toward him. I was quieter, more angular, the kind of teenager who spent Friday nights reading and genuinely preferred it. I wasn't unhappy, I just wasn't Marcus. My parents loved us both. I want to be careful here and honest, because this isn't a story about monsters. But love isn't always equal, and equal isn't always fair, and in our house those two things got confused in ways that took me years to untangle. Marcus's college fund was started when he was born. Mine was started when I was 7, and quietly redirected when I was 16 to cover a legal problem Marcus had after a party went wrong. Nobody told me. I found out by accident, when I was filling out my FAFSA's senior year, and the account number my mother had given me came up empty. When I asked my father about it, he sat me down at the kitchen table, the same table where we'd eaten 10,000 dinners, and told me the money was gone, that Marcus had needed it, that family takes care of family. I said, I'm family too. He said, Marcus didn't have other options. What he meant, though he didn't say it, was that Marcus didn't have my grades, my scholarships, my ability to find a way. He meant that I would be fine. That word again. I got a partial scholarship to Ohio State. I applied for every loan I qualified for. I worked 5 hours a week at a campus dining hall, and wore the same 4 sweaters for 2 years. I did not ask my parents for a single dollar, and they did not offer one. When I came home for Thanksgiving freshman year, my mother had redecorated my bedroom as a home office. There was a treadmill where my bed had been. She'd kept Marcus's room exactly as he left it, pennants on the wall and everything. I noticed. I didn't say anything. I was getting good at that. The summer after my junior year, I came home for 6 weeks, because my apartment lease had a gap, and flying back would have cost more than I could spare. I slept on the pull-out couch in the office that used to be my room, and I worked double shifts at a restaurant downtown. One Thursday evening, I overheard my parents talking in the kitchen. Not arguing, just talking. The calm conversational kind that's somehow more revealing than anything said in anger. My mother said, Marcus is going to need help with the down payment. My father said, we'll pull from the account. My mother said, there's not much left. My father said, there's enough. Then she said, we should have set more aside. And my father said, we didn't think Jess would end up needing so much from us. I was in the hallway. I had not asked them for a single thing in 3 years. I had not received a single thing in 3 years. and my father had just described me as someone who needed too much. I went back to school 2 weeks early and told my landlord I'd pay the overlap in rent myself. I picked up a fourth shift. I did not call home for a month. And when I finally did, nobody asked where I'd been. I graduated in May, 3 months before I turned 22. Not 18. I want to clarify something right here, because the title of this story says 18, and I owe you an explanation for that. I was kicked out at 18. Yes, but not from a childhood home in the way you might imagine. What happened was this. The August after I turned 18, a month before I was supposed to leave for my first year at Ohio State, a woman named Patricia Howe died. She was my maternal grandmother. My mother's mother, a sharp-eyed woman with a vegetable garden and an opinion about everything. She and I had been close in the particular way that grandparents and the less favored grandchild sometimes are. She saw me, clearly, without the fog of parental expectation. She called me every Sunday. She taught me to make pie crust from scratch. She kept every card I ever sent her in a shoebox in her closet. Patricia Howe left her estate to be divided among her grandchildren. There were 4 of us, me, Marcus, and 2 cousins on my uncle's side. The estate wasn't enormous. A small house, some savings, some jewelry, and a piece of undeveloped land outside of town that a developer had recently gotten interested in. The attorney read the will in my uncle's living room on a Wednesday afternoon. Patricia had split things 4 ways, but with a specific note attached to my share. A letter in her own handwriting that said she'd observed, over many years, that I was the grandchild most likely to need protecting, and therefore she was leaving me the land. Just me. The land that the developer wanted. The land that turned out to be worth, at current market assessment, just over $200,000. My mother cried. Not grief crying, a different kind. My father excused himself to make a phone call. Marcus looked at the floor. My uncle looked at me with an expression I still don't have a word for. On the drive home, my father said, "We should talk about that land." I said, "Okay." He said, "The responsible thing would be to sell it and divide the proceeds fairly among the family." I said, "Grandma Patricia didn't divide it that way." He said, "Your grandmother wasn't always thinking practically at the end." "She was absolutely thinking practically at the end," I said. That was when he told me I was being selfish. That was when my mother said I'd always had a chip on my shoulder. That was when Marcus, who had been quiet in the back seat, said maybe Jess just needs time to think about it, and my father said, "Marcus, stay out of it." And Marcus went quiet again. I did not sell the land. I consulted an attorney the following week, a woman my grandmother had already spoken to, because Patricia Howe had anticipated exactly this moment. The land was transferred cleanly into my name. There was nothing my parents could do about it. 2 weeks before I was supposed to leave for college, my father came to my room. He stood in the doorway. He said, "If you won't do right by this family, then you can figure out your life on your own." I thought he was expressing frustration. I said, "Dad, I start school in 2 weeks." He said, "Find somewhere else to stay until then." He said it quietly, the way people say things they've decided in advance. My mother didn't come out of the bedroom. I called my friend Dana, who let me sleep on her couch. I left with 1 duffel bag because I thought I was coming back. I wasn't. When I called 3 days later to say I needed to get the rest of my things, my mother said maybe it was best if I took some space this semester. Some space. I have thought about those words many times over 10 years. Some space, as if what had happened was a minor disagreement about curfew. I got a storage unit. I got a second job. I deferred college for a semester, then applied again. I did not call home on my birthday that October. Nobody called me either. Here is what the next 10 years looked like. In the broad strokes, I built a life. It wasn't fast or glamorous. And there were years that were genuinely hard in ways I'm not going to romanticize. I finished college. I took a job with an environmental consulting firm in Columbus. I was good at it. I got promoted. I bought a small house at 27. Partly with a loan and partly with money from the sale of a portion of the land my grandmother left me. I'd held on to most of it. Let it appreciate. and made a careful decision when the timing was right. I had friends, a good therapist I started seeing at 24, a dog named Harold who made everything better by existing. I dated someone for 3 years, and when that ended it was sad and mutual, and I survived it. I thought about my parents. I won't pretend otherwise. You don't stop thinking about your parents, just because they behaved badly. But thinking about someone and needing them are different things. And I'd spent 18 years learning to live without their consistent presence, so in some ways the distance just clarified what had always been true. Marcus contacted me when I was 24. A short email, stiff and over-formal, like he'd rewritten it several times. He said he'd heard I was doing okay. He said he hoped there was a chance for things to get better someday. He did not apologize for anything specific, and I noticed that. But I also noticed that he reached out at all, which was more than our parents had done. I wrote back. We started talking occasionally. Slowly, carefully, like two people learning to trust ice. Through Marcus, in pieces over years, I learned things. My parents' financial situation had deteriorated badly. My father's business. He'd run a small contracting company for 20 years. Had collapsed during a slow stretch and a bad partnership. They'd refinanced the house twice. There had been health issues, my mother's hip, my father's blood pressure. The creeping costs that come with aging without enough savings. Marcus helped where he could, but Marcus had his own family by then, a wife named Stephanie and a little girl, and his resources weren't unlimited. I don't say any of this to gloat. I say it because it is context. It is the weather system that preceded the knock on my door. That morning, that 7 a.m. Tuesday morning in March. I stood in my doorway and looked at my parents, and they looked smaller than I remembered. That's the thing nobody tells you about holding onto an image of someone for a decade. The image stays fixed while the person keeps aging, and the gap between what you remember and what's standing in front of you can knock the wind out of you. My mother said, "Jess, can we come in?" Not a question technically. More like someone reading from a script they'd rehearsed in the car. I said yes, and stepped back. Because I am not someone who turns people away from a door at 7 in the morning, even people who turned me away from one. They sat at my kitchen table. My father had his hands folded in front of him and kept glancing at the room like he was taking inventory. My mother's eyes were red. I poured 2 more cups of coffee without asking and set them down, and nobody spoke for what felt like a long time. My father said, "We need to talk to you about something serious." I said, "Okay." My mother said, "We're sorry to just show up." I said, "It's fine." She said, "We didn't have your number." And Marcus said he couldn't give it to us without asking you first. I thought about Marcus, and how long he'd been quietly trying to hold 2 separate worlds in his hands without dropping either. I made a note to call him. Then my father said, "We're losing the house." He said it flatly, without drama, which was somehow worse than if he'd cried. The bank had given them a timeline. They'd exhausted the options they could exhaust. They were looking at the kind of situation that spirals if something doesn't interrupt it. I sat with that for a moment. My mother said, "We know we don't have the right to ask." She said it the way people say things when they're hoping the other person will interrupt and say, "Of course you do." I didn't interrupt. I let the sentence stand. My father said, "We heard you did well with the land." With your grandmother's land. He almost couldn't say it, I could see that. The words costing him something. And I realized in that moment that this was the first time in 10 years that he had acknowledged, directly, that the land existed and that it was mine. Not the family's. Mine. I asked them how much they needed. My mother told me. It was a significant number. Not impossible, but significant. I looked at the table between us. The same kind of table we'd sat around for all those dinners. And I thought about the version of this conversation I'd imagined, in bad moments, over the years. The one where I got to say everything. Where I listed every instance and they finally understood and apologized fully, and we all cried, and it was resolved. That conversation, I had come to understand, was a fantasy. Real repair is quieter and messier and less satisfying than the movies make it look. I said, I'm not going to write you a check today. My mother's face shifted. I said, I'm also not going to let you lose the house. My father looked up. I said, I want to be clear with you about something first though. And I need you to actually hear it. They were very still. I said, I spent a lot of years believing the problem was me. That I was too sensitive, too unforgiving, too focused on what I didn't get instead of what I had. I worked through a lot of that, and I'm not still in the fire of it. But I need you to know that what happened mattered. The money that was mine that went to Marcus without a conversation. The bedroom that became an office. The driveway. The duffel bag. All of it mattered. My father said, I know. 2 words, he said, I have known for a long time. And the thing about hearing that from a 63-year-old man who has never been good at saying hard things is that it doesn't fix anything. But it is not nothing. My mother cried then. Real crying, not the performance version. She said she'd been afraid, for years, that she'd made me into someone who didn't need them, and that she'd been relieved about it, and ashamed of being relieved. I didn't entirely understand that, but I recognized it as something true being said out loud, maybe for the first time. I did not forgive them completely in that kitchen. Forgiveness, the real kind, is not a door you walk through once. It's more like a direction you keep choosing. What I did was tell them I would help, and tell them what helping would and would not look like, and mean it. I called my attorney that afternoon. I called Marcus that evening. He answered on the first ring, and when I told him what had happened, he was quiet for a moment and then he said, I was hoping you'd call. I said, I know. He said, I should have found a way to reach out sooner, back then. I mean, back when it happened. I said, you were 16. He said, still. I said, yeah. Still. The house situation took 3 months to work through. My parents didn't lose it. I won't give you the specific numbers because that's not the point. And the point is not the money. The point is what money represents, which is safety, and who gets to decide who deserves it, and whether the answer to that question can change. My parents and I see each other now. Not constantly, not easily, but genuinely. We had dinner together last November, the 4 of us, me, Marcus, Mom, and Dad, at Marcus's house, and his daughter, who is 4 and absolutely hilarious, insisted on sitting next to me the entire time. My mother brought pie. I did not think about the fact that I taught her how to make that crust, or who taught me. Or maybe I did think about it, briefly, and let it go. My grandmother's land, most of it, still sits outside of town. Some of it I've sold carefully as needed. The rest I'm holding, not because I need to, but because Patricia Howe left it to me on purpose, and I honor things that were done on purpose. Last spring I drove out to where the land is, on a clear afternoon, and I walked the perimeter the way you do when something is yours, and you want to feel that. The grass was coming in, and there were wildflowers I didn't know the names of, and a creek at the back edge that I hadn't seen before, or hadn't noticed. I stood there for a while just listening to the water. I think about what my grandmother saw in me, all those years ago. A kid who might need protecting. A kid who could be trusted with something that would last. I think about how she sat down and wrote a letter, and talked to a lawyer, and planned ahead for a storm she could see coming. And how I didn't know any of it until the day it mattered. You can't always choose your family, but sometimes, if you're lucky, someone in that family chooses you back. Deliberately, quietly, in a way that takes years to fully understand. That's what I'm still doing. Understanding it. Standing on ground that was given to me by someone who loved me enough to think ahead, and deciding, every day, what I want to build on it. If someone in your life ever left you something that protected you when you needed it most, tell me in the comments. And if this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Hit subscribe if you want to be here for the next one. I'll see you then.